I came across a YouTube short recently that asked the question, why were we so skinny in the 1960s? Which is a fair question because in the 60s, we had an obesity rate in America of about 13%. To put that into perspective, now, currently as of 2025, we have an obesity rate that is closing in on 43%. And this is all kind of wild because it's not like people were known in the 60s for their healthy food choices. So why in the world did we have such lower body fat percentages back in the 60s? From my research, it turns out there are really 4 simple basic things that they're doing in the 60s that we aren't doing now that made all the difference. Let's dive into it. My name's Autumn. I'm a certified clinical nutritionist with my master's nutrition human performance, and today's video is sponsored by Kettle and Fire. More on them in a bit. Okay, so back in the 60s, their nutrition guidelines were very simple. Their basic food and nutrition guidelines at the time were to follow the basic 4, to have meat, dairy, fruit/vegetables, and grains. It was less nuanced. There was a lot less guidance. It wasn't like the 50-page report that we now get from like the USDA dietary guidelines. So within this conversation, you'll often see 2 big theories floating around for why it is people think that we weighed less then than we do now. The first one has to do with meat intake over time. Some will say that our meat intake has really increased, which has caused the obesity rate to go up. A Business Insider article shows that we eat about 90 calories worth of meat more now per day than we did in the 1960s. Interestingly, most of that is actually coming from chicken, which rose dramatically since the 1960s, and beef intake has actually significantly decreased since the 60s and 70s. But this really doesn't explain the weight gain. Meat is high in protein, whether it's from chicken or it's from beef, which means it's very, very satiating. In fact, there's so much research on high protein diets now and how it is one of the most effective ways to achieve a weight loss goal because it helps to make you feel so full, so satisfied that you just can't overeat. Which leads us to the second theory, and it's that our calorie intake over time has increased. Now, when you look into the research of this, the specific numbers really vary, I think because we don't have a firm grasp of what we really ate in the 1960s, simply because we weren't really doing the research on nutrition that we are now, so we don't have the data. But one study shows that we ate about 2,800 calories on average per day in the 1960s, whereas now we're eating about 3,600 calories per day. That's a 24% increase. And what I find absolutely fascinating about that is that's with us having more information about how much calories or how many calories are in our food now than we ever have before. You can't really go to a restaurant now or get something to eat or like get a packaged food item without knowing exactly how many calories are in your food. People now are way more savvy and understand way more about the calorie intake they're getting now versus when they were in the 1960s. In fact, most people have used some form of a calorie tracker and tracked their calories. There was none of that in the 1960s, at least nowhere close to the degree that we have it now. Yet even with this bigger focus on calories that we have now, we're eating way more calories than we did in the 1960s. So clearly just focusing on the calorie level of our food isn't really the solution. Instead, we have to understand why it is that we're consuming so much more food. Something is causing us to eat substantially more now in the 2020s versus in the 1960s. So what were they doing in the 1960s that made them have a substantially lower obesity rate? Turns out it's really 4 main things. Before we get into that, I want to give a huge thank you to a sponsor, Kettle and Fire. Kettle and Fire is my all-time favorite bone broth company because they slowly simmer bones from grass-fed cows to make sure that they're pulling out as much collagen as possible. I love using bone broth because it does add a whole food source of collagen into my meals, like my soups, my stews, my chilies. I'll even use it in smoothies every now and then too. And I absolutely know how to make bone broth, but I do not have the time to make bone broth. I have a toddler. I'm currently pregnant. I'm running a business. I don't have the time to like slowly simmer bones from grass-fed cows, cool it, and then like store it all. So I love that Kettle and Fire makes it really easy for me to have high quality bone broth just literally in my pantry. That way I can add it to any meal that I want and get an instant boost of high quality whole food collagen. And Kettle and Fire tastes amazing and it's so easy to add into any type of meal. I'll use it in my detox broccoli soup. I'll use it as the base of my beef stew recipe. I'll even use it in my chili recipes too. And Kettle and Fire is super generous and they're offering my community 20% off your bone broth purchase when you use code AUTUMNBAITS at checkout. So make sure you stock up and I'll have the link down description below so you don't miss out on that discount. Okay, so there's 4 big things that people were doing different back in the 1960s that we just really aren't doing now that made it so they have an obesity rate of only 13%. 13% versus our 42%. And the first big one is that home cooked meals were the rule, not the exception. Most people ate at home. Yes, there were like some TV dinners, those were starting to become popular, but meals made at home was the norm. And even the school lunches followed those basic guidelines that I mentioned earlier. They would have some type of really high quality protein, they would have some fruit, some bread, some veggies, and then probably milk. When I was looking through that Quora thread to see really firsthand what it was that people were eating in the 1960s and what they remembered eating, they would say it was things like roast chicken and meatloaf, beef stew, steak and potatoes, and always some overcooked, squishy canned veggies. My dad said that they would pretty much always have like pot roast, and my mom has a very specific, not fond memory of lima beans. So honestly, it's not like these were necessarily the healthiest types of food, but the fact that they were meals prepared at home really makes all the difference. This helps to reduce the sugar intake, helps to get more protein, and helps to increase the vegetable intake and just eat more whole food. That combination alone helps to significantly raise satiety hormones within the body like peptide YY and CCK, which means that people feel full and satisfied and that they don't need to overeat. Versus now, people heavily rely on a lot of pre-made foods. And these foods are often ultra processed to the point where we don't get the same satiety cues that are going to be triggered, and therefore we need to eat more and more and more in order to feel satisfied. So a big thing we can do for this first category is to make a lot more of our meals at home. But I would say to make sure they taste better than they did in the 1960s. This will make it so you actually enjoy your food and so you won't lean more heavily on those ultra processed, hyper palatable foods. Learn a few basic, simple recipes to start with, things that you enjoy, things that you're comfortable with making, and you can always expand from there. Like I have my super simple cottage cheese bowl that went absolutely viral last year, and it's literally just 3 ingredients and it takes like 5 minutes or less to prepare. I'll have that video right here if you want to check it out. But you can make things like tuna salad, you can make things like scrambled eggs, like it doesn't have to be complicated. Which if you do need a little more guidance, I do have a free 5-day high protein meal plan. It has breakfast, lunch, and dinner recipes for each of those 5 days, and they're all delicious and very simple. So if you want to check out that free download with the free recipes, I'll have the link pop up right here somewhere, but you can also find the link down description below. Highly recommend that you check that out, especially if you don't really know where to start or you just need some fresh ideas. The second thing that they had going for them in the 1960s is that they had limited access to ultra processed foods. Ultra processed foods weren't really quite a thing yet. Yes, there were a lot of processed foods, which are a lot different, but ultra processed is like the next level of processing that really strips down the satiety and makes it so that you are so much less satisfied from your food and therefore need to eat even more. These are foods that are primarily going to have ingredients that you don't recognize, and typically a long list of ingredients that you would not be able to just get at your grocery store and recreate at home. In fact, estimates say that about 70% of our intake comes from these ultra processed foods. And some studies have found that these ultra processed foods can make us eat about 800 calories more a day because they're so much less satiating. So if you eat less of those ultra processed foods, it means that you naturally are going to feel more satisfied and therefore naturally eat less. So what we can really do to mimic those 1960s is to limit our own access to these foods. Get familiar with what ultra processed foods are, especially full meals of ultra processed foods, and assess your intake. I have a full video of the most common ultra processed foods and really easy swaps for those. If you want to check it out, I'll have it linked right up here. Okay, the third thing that they did in the 1960s is that they were a lot more accidentally active. A large portion of the workforce back then had more physically demanding jobs. They also had a lot less structured activity, meaning like they didn't really work out. My dad will always say that he was super embarrassed when he was younger because his dad was like kind of a health nut at the time and would go for runs, and his friends would make fun of him and be like, why is your dad going for a jog? What is he running from? So because people had more active jobs, they had a full day where they were more active versus a full day of sitting in front of a computer screen and then also probably commuting. And also there's less active playtime for kids too. Tech, social media, computer games, all of these things make it so that kids are going to be a lot more stationary, be sitting at home as their preferred source of entertainment. This drastically lowers how active kids are too, and they are really only getting their activity from more of these structured exercise times, like maybe PE, or maybe if they're in some type of sport. My mom said that if you had to stay inside, that was a punishment when she was a kid. Kids back in the 60s really didn't have anything inside that would entertain them as much, so they had to go outside and be active and play instead for their entertainment. They would play sports, they'd play outside at a park. Or with my mom and dad, they said they would play a game that they literally called kick the can, and I still don't quite understand the rules beyond like you would kick a can. Let me know in the comments if you know exactly what that game is. But ranging from kids to adults, everybody was a lot more accidentally active back in the 1960s versus now. So what we can do is a little bit more tricky because it's not like you can just get up, leave your job, and like switch careers entirely. But one thing we can do is get a walking desk. This is actually something I really want to do. That way I can get some activity while I'm standing at my desk. That alone can help to at least provide some activity throughout the day that we're missing out on from just sitting, or even just scheduling in going for walks throughout the day, even if it's just like 10 minutes at a time. And then in addition to that, making sure that you are really consistent with the structured exercise, like 3 to 4 days per week of some type of strength training as well. Ultimately, we just really need to counter our more sedentary lifestyle that is just inherent with modern day society. And the fourth really big thing that they did in the 1960s is that they got on average 2 hours more sleep than we do. Less sleep is significantly tied with obesity and weight gain, not to mention all the health risks as well. Low sleep causes increased hunger hormones, so you're going to feel a lot more hungry the next day. It also increases our preferences for sweet foods, and it increases our preferences for larger portion sizes. Now, I wasn't around the 1960s, but from what I have heard and what I have read, there was just simply not as much to do at night as there is now. Back then, there wasn't TV shows playing all throughout the night. TV would literally like stop playing at a certain point of the day. There also weren't laptops and computers and phones that you could just be looking at a bright screen at and stay up later than you really should. So people would just actually go to bed. Plus, they were more active throughout the day, which meant that they were more tired and actually did want to go to sleep. So what we can do now is, first of all, we need to set bedtimes again for ourselves. Because there are so many different temptations to stay up late, whether it be like binge watching a Netflix show or just scrolling on your phone, we need to actually set time limits for when we're going to be going to sleep. And on top of that, we really should be setting time limits for how long we're going to be using our phones and TVs. Simply put, the more we're looking at our phones, the more we're looking at TVs, the later we're going to stay up, the less sleep we're going to get, the lower energy we're going to feel, and the more it's going to impact our overall health and weight gain. Now, interestingly, the 1920s actually had some pretty solid nutrition and health advice. So make sure you check that out next with this video right here. Also, if you're new to my channel and you love this science-backed information, make sure you subscribe right here. Come out new videos every Tuesday and Thursday. All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in my next video.